And now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, if I could. Professor Dr. Thomas Eberle is a professor emeritus at the Institute of Sociology at the University of St. Gallen. He has been professor emeritus since 2015. He was the vice president of the European Sociological Association, president of the Swiss Sociological Association, member of the Social Science Policy, guest professor at the University of Constance and Vienna, a regular lecturer at the University of Basel and lecturer at the University of Zurich. He is also a member of the board of directors of the American Association, or was rather, of Applied and Clinical Sociology, a member of the steering committee and expert group of the Swiss National Science Foundation's priority program for future Switzerland. When he completed his doctorate, he won the Amicizia Award for the best doctorate in economic sciences at the University of St. Gallen in 1984, and the John Latsis Award for outstanding scientific achievements, also in 1984. The list of groups that Thomas belongs to is so huge that I can't possibly get through all of them, so I'll omit that. He has also published 28 journal papers, over 100 book chapters, 4 monographs, and 14 edited books. So it's just he's just had a wonderfully productive career so far. And I would just make one little comment. If you read through the titles and things that Thomas has published, you see a real set of diverse interests. On the one hand, he's published a lot in philosophy and the methodology of the social sciences. He has also done a lot of work on clinical sociology and clinical practice, I think, which is very interesting. And even a book on photography and society. So he has a wonderful career here of work, a great body of work. And we're very honored to have him as our keynote speaker. And today his talk is entitled, Schutz's Stranger Revisited. Thomas, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction, Michael. Dear colleagues, good morning in both Americas, good afternoon in Europe, and good evening in Asia. Thank you for being with me online. I would have loved to see you all face to face in St. Louis. When I first read The Stranger of Alfred Schutz about 50 years ago, I was impressed by several things. How simply and clearly this essay was written, how easily I could identify with the immigrants' experiences, although lacking this experience myself at the time, and how useful all these concepts suddenly proved to be in this concrete context, concepts which appeared so much more difficult to grasp in Schutz's theoretical papers. Later, I could relate to Schutz's Stranger even much better, especially during my stay as a visiting scholar at UC Santa Barbara in California, where I lived for 2.5 years in the early 80s, and later on in my other personal experiences of being a stranger in diverse social settings. And nowadays, we have the different manuscripts of The Stranger and also a better understanding of Schutz's overall work in which it is embedded. Today, I'm going to revisit Schutz's Stranger. My presentation has the following structure. First, I start with a topos of the stranger. Second, I distinguish 3 different kinds of strangeness in Schutz. Third, I have a look at his methodological considerations. Fourth, I ponder 2 critical points concerning the real experience of being a stranger. Fifth, I sum up and come to a conclusion with an outlook. First point. The stranger is an ancient and probably universal topos. It seems that all peoples of this world have descriptions of encounters with strangers. Obviously, all families, clans, tribes, peoples, nations, and so on distinguish between members and non-members. Non-members entering a new social setting may make experiences of being a stranger as Schutz describes them. And the in-group may experience some of their behaviors as strange and call him a stranger. Of course, the actual typification may vary culturally as well as situationally. European scholars often follow the tradition to go back to the roots of a notion, mostly in Greek or Latin. The Greek had two notions of a stranger, xenos and barbaros. Both notions still exist in the languages of European origin. A barbarian is a person from an alien land, culture, or group believed to be inferior, uncivilized, or violent. As a noun chiefly used in historical references, as an adjective still used for a rude, crude, uneducated, or uncivilized person. In both cases, it's devaluative. Xenos is the stranger, the unknown, the foreign, but also the guest. It is the more neutral word and still used in social science. We have the evaluative connotations in word combinations with xenos, xenophobia, the fear and hatred of strangers or foreigners, or anything that is strange or foreign, and its antonym, xenophilia, which is the love for, attraction to, or appreciation of foreign people, manners, customs, and cultures. Xenology is the science of strangers which attempts to reach a deeper and meta-theoretical analysis of philosophy of stranger, especially in a cultural context. The term was created by a sociologist from Cameroon, Doualam Dedi, in the late 70s, and has spread quickly in sociology and political science. There is finally xenological phenomenology, phenomenological analysis of the experience of the alien, as Bernhard Waldenfels calls it, who published a whole series of books on the topic. We are having a conference on xenological phenomenology right now. Xenology and xenological phenomenology are comparatively neutral terms, while the others are obviously evaluative, either negatively or positively. Now let me ask you a question. When you hear people talking about strangers, how often do they do this in a strict, neutral, indifferent way? And how often do you hear evaluative denotations or connotations, either negative or positive ones? In his essay, The Stranger, Schutz didn't mention such evaluations. He undertook a strictly formal analysis, searching for how strangeness is constituted. The title of his first manuscript was The Strange and the Stranger, but he narrowed it down to the personal type in the second manuscript. Der Fremde in German, the stranger in English, are quite neutral terms, similar to xenos. Schutz confined it further to, quote, an adult individual of our times and civilization, who tries to be permanently accepted or at least tolerated by the group which he approaches, end of quote. He explicitly excludes visitors and guests, children or primitives, and individuals of different levels of civilization. No barbarians, so to say. As a side note, I may add that there are many more sociologically interesting forms of strangers. For example, tourists in a foreign culture, visitors of indigenous tribes, or a very topical theme in Europe right now, immigrants who refuse to assimilate and want to preserve their patriarchal clan culture in a Western democracy. Georg Simmel, in his essay with the same title, had targeted the same kind of stranger as Schutz did, a person who already lives in the local community but is perceived as a stranger. He also provided a formal analysis with much more complicated formulations than Schutz, and from the perspective of the local society. Schutz focuses on the subjective experience of being a stranger and his problems of orientation in a foreign culture. He builds on his previous analysis in the Phenomenology of the social world. How is meaning constituted in our lived experience and in time? How is the subjective meaning of actions constituted? How can an ego understand the subjective meaning of the other's action? How is the social world spatially, temporally, and socially structured? The different forms of givenness of the other? And what are the methodological implications for an interpretive sociology? In this context, we find already, this is the second point of my presentation, two kinds of strangeness. First, the other is strange, the other is a stranger. Schutz follows Husserl's distinction between the realm of one's own experiences, the realm of ownness, and the realm of the other's experiences. I have a privileged access to my own experience, but no direct access to the other's experiences. Schutz concludes that I can understand my own subjective life world best, the subjective meanings of my actions, of my intentions, of my motivations, of my dreams and fantasies. It's noteworthy here that Schutz sees strangeness only in the other. He never considers that the person could also be strange to itself. Even later, when he integrated Charles Cooley's concept that interaction acts as a mirror or looking glass, since one's sense of self is built on others, he did not revise this position. It remains subjective sense versus objective sense. The difficulty is how to understand the other. In German, he calls this the problem of Fremdverstehen, and fremd is strange. This is not visible in the English translation, as so many other things are not visible in the English translation. There is no direct access to the other's experience. Understanding the subjective sense of the other is mediated by signs, marks, and symbols. I can observe only fragments of the other's behaviors, and I interpret everything based on my own experiences, based on my subjective stock of knowledge at hand, and based on my subjective relevance system. Schutz skips the question how the other is transcendently constituted, and just posits the other's existence and monadic analogy in general thesis. In this mundane view, ego and the alter ego each have their own biographically determined stock of knowledge at hand, and they overlap only partially. This is why we never can fully understand each other. Intersubjective understanding always remains an approximation. Schutz's pragmatic turn in his personality manuscript of 1936 sheds new light on this analysis. If my subjective stock of knowledge with its typifications and relevant systems is socially derived, I obviously share much of it with those individuals whom I was socialized with in the same cultural setting at the same time. I have learned to interpret my own experiences with the same types and relevances as the others of my in-group. This is why Schutz speaks of home group and foreign group in the stranger, and of cultural patterns of each group. The stranger is struggling with two different systems of interpretation of two different groups. Even with shared cultural patterns of an in-group, intersubjective understanding remains problematic. As Schutz points out in A Stranger, the critical point is not if we use the same types or display the same relevances. The crucial issue is if we share common experiences. The types we use, every word, every sentence, are surrounded by fringes connecting them to the past and to the future, but also, quote, with a halo of emotional values and irrational implications which themselves are ineffable, end of quote. Experiences are different not only between in-group and stranger, but they vary also in form of diverse biographies within each group. Even in an intimate relationship, we can't understand the other completely. Our interpretation always remains an approximation. We have to distinguish here between the possibility to understand and the willingness to understand. Approximation concerns the possibility to understand. How far I want to understand the other depends on my situation or relevance system, on my actual practical purposes. Sometimes I try to understand the other as well as I can. At other times, I may not really care. It varies time-wise, but it also depends on the degree of intimacy of a relationship. In modern society, with its high degree of division of labor, we interact with many people whom we perceive mainly as personal types of pursuing a function. And in the sense of practical knowledge, it's enough to know the proper interaction pattern for that transaction. In personal relationships, the degree of intimacy depends on the mutual interest in each other, but also on the mutual willingness to open up to each other. I heard many a wife complain that her husband has always remained a stranger to her until the end of his life. Never opened up. So, there is strangeness of the other as a person because I don't have direct access to the other subjective experiences. The other person remains transcendent in a way. But there is also a second kind of strangeness in Schutz. Strange is what is unknown, foreign, new, unfamiliar. This kind of strangeness has little to do with the other as a person. This kind of strangeness is related to the elements of knowledge. Extreme strangeness and extreme familiarity are the two poles of a continuum, but they are boundary values which are hardly experienced in everyday life. It's always a question of relative strangeness and relative familiarity. In The Stranger, Schutz defines different zones of relevance and introduces the distinction of William James between knowledge of acquaintance and knowledge about. The more familiar something is, as for example, the great deal of recipe knowledge we have acquired, the more it is part of the unquestioned and unquestionable, as the taken for granted part of our natural worldview. Experiences are perceived as strange when they can't get adequately grasped by our repertoire of types at hand. Then they appear problematic and require new explorations and new solutions. Schutz emphasizes that strangeness and familiarity are not specific to the situation of the stranger, but are general categories of our interpretation of the world. Strangeness in this respect is a fundamental experience of our life. In everyday life of an adult, the familiar elements of knowledge dominate. But now and then, here and there, something strange pops up, and we have to decide how to handle it. For a stranger in a foreign group, however, so many elements are strange at the same time that he or she experiences a shock as the Schutz describes it. The distance to the local cultural pattern is so large that the stranger is in a position of objectivity and doubtful loyalty. This leads us to a third kind of strangeness in Schutz, which concerns the social relationship and especially the social acceptance by the foreign group. Schutz explicitly mentions this point, but does not further elaborate it. In the definition of the stranger as an immigrant, he posits that the stranger wants to be accepted or at least tolerated by the foreign group, but he does not discuss if this is actually the case. He treats the situation before this becomes an issue. In any case, there is a significant difference between being tolerated or being accepted. In rural areas of Switzerland and in the neighboring countries as well, it can happen that the natives of a village still consider you to be a stranger, even if you have been living there for 30 years. And there are people who will always consider a foreigner as a foreigner, even if he's meanwhile spent most of his or her life in this country, and even if he or she has acquired a local passport which officially confirms him or her as a proper citizen. Of course, Schutz sees this point too. In the first manuscript of the stranger, he writes that even when the immigrant assimilates, the natives may still treat him as an outsider. Their relationship then is not reciprocal, but unilateral. But Schutz omits this proposition in the published version. Schutz further omits another passage from the first manuscript, where he writes that this relationship has to be investigated in a dual way, from the standpoint of the stranger and from the standpoint of the members of the in-group. He does this in a few instances, but he mainly focuses on the perspective of the stranger. Social acceptance as the third kind of strangeness becomes only visible if the perspective of the in-group is further elaborated. Jochen Dreher and Max Gropper, and maybe some others at this conference, did that. Compared with theories of intercultural comparisons, Schutz's approach has a number of advantages. One of them is that he speaks of groups, not of nations, not of societies, and not of cultures. He basically still pursues a methodological individualism, but after the pragmatic turn, he often speaks of groups of individuals who share common knowledge or cultural patterns. In everyday life, a stranger is interacting with concrete other individuals, not with a society, a culture, or a nation. Schutz was aware that he was not just a European immigrant to the US, but a Viennese Jewish bank lawyer and academic who tried to assimilate to different groups, as to the people in the local banking business in New York, to the academic circles at the New School, to music lovers at the opera, to other phenomenologists and sociologists, and so on. But ultimately, strangeness and assimilation happen between individuals. And although members of the in-group may share a cultural patterns with other members, they still have their unique biographic experiences. As Schutz points out, this poses a problem to the stranger, as he tends to generalize mere individual traits into properties of a cultural pattern, and thereby, quote, constructs a social world of pseudo-anonymity, pseudo-intimacy, and pseudo-typicality. End of quote. Members of the in-group may apply a variety of designations and make use of all sorts of symbolic constructions to fashion their relationship with a stranger. I agree with Roch's Brubaker that social scientists should not employ common sense labeling of collective categories such as race, ethnicity, or nationhood. We should rather adopt a social constructionist perspective and observe how people use such terms, in which situations, to what purpose, and when. If we use these terms as sociologists, we run the risk of engaging in the same reifications as people in the street do, and adopt an essentialist position. This is also in line with Jochen Dreher, who emphasized this point in his introductory presentation too. Demarcations are empirical data, and any demarcation can be instrumentalized and politicized. But I think it's important to distinguish here between demarcations which are used in a discourse about strangers, pursued in their absence, and the actual interaction with a stranger. Discourses happen in the media as well as in groups. People may behave nicely in a concrete interaction with a stranger while displaying a different attitude behind their back. The worst experience a stranger can possibly have is to get treated as a dehumanized object or as a downgraded, depreciated object in direct interaction. Reification as a social pathology, as Alexis Gross said in his presentation. It is already painful enough when you realize that you belong to that category which is being depreciated in discourses, for example, in the media. But if you are depreciated in direct interaction, it's really brutal. George Yancey told us many horrifying examples of such brutality in his touching keynote. As we know from the Nazi era in relation to the Jews, the discourse in the mass media can substantially influence how people treat others in direct interaction too. So this was my discussion on the three different kinds of strangeness in Schutz. Let me move to the third point now, some methodological considerations. As I have written much about methodology, let me briefly point out Schutz's remarks in this respect. Schutz's essay, The Stranger, is a typical case, how he attempts to present an alternative sociology without criticizing his colleagues. We all know that he undertook a mundane phenomenological constitutive analysis of how a stranger's experiences are partly, how a stranger experiences a partly foreign world. But he does not mention it. He avoids the terms phenomenology and constitutive analysis, as nobody would have understood what he meant. In his first manuscript, he argues that he can't take well-established concepts of conventional sociology, such as William Graham Sumner's concept of the relationships between in-group and out-group, as a starting point of his analysis. He can't take them as a starting point of his analysis, as this concept itself depends on the question how the social categories of strangeness and familiarity are constituted. He omits this in the published version and builds a bridge to the established sociology by saying, quote, as a convenient starting point, we shall investigate how the cultural pattern of group life presents itself to the common sense of a man who lives his everyday life within the group among his fellow men, end of quote. And he's quick to point out the difference between this perspective and the perspective of the social scientist, who is, quote, a disinterested scientific onlooker on the social world who tries to observe, describe, and classify the social world as clearly as possible and in well-ordered terms in accordance with the scientific ideals of coherence, consistency, and analytical consequence, end of quote. Schutz points to the excellent literature on assimilation by sociologists such as Sumner, William Thomas, Florian Znaniecki, Robert Park, Everett Stonquist, Georg Simmel, and so on. But he omitted what he had written in the first manuscript, namely that all these investigations of cultural patterns, about value patterns, systems of institutions, codes and rules were written from the perspective of an observer, and that they hardly help us solving the problems of our everyday lives or analyzing social relationships where actors orient to subjective meanings. In the first manuscript, Schutz also writes that it's the task of the sociologist as a disinterested observer to uncover the scheme of reference to which the actor in the social world orients. And he adds that this is what Max Weber had in mind with his postulate that sociology must grasp the subjective sense of an actor's action, quite contrary to a Parsonian understanding of Weber. Schutz was well advised to omit all of this in his published version, first in order to get his paper accepted by the American Journal of Sociology, and second in order to avoid affronting all his sociological colleagues who adhere to different conceptions of sociology and, or as I said, had a Parsonian understanding of Weber's approach. Schutz designates his essay as social psychological, which allows him to talk about subjective experiences and problems of orientation. And he calls his approach a general theory of interpretation. The omitted passages, however, reveal clearly that he intends to make a substantial contribution to a true, non-ambiguous conception of interpretive sociology in Weber's sense. Against the background of the dominating sociology at the time, Schutz showed the way to an alternative sociology. Unfortunately, this never became really clear in his methodological writings, not even in their last version of 1953. Schutz calls for the construction of models of the social world, second-order constructions based on first-order constructions. These models are guided by the scientist's relevant systems and consist of a homunculus with a consciousness, a certain biographical stock of knowledge, and invariant in order to and because motives. The most radical was his postulate of subjective interpretation, where he demands that every human action and its results must be traced back to the subjective sense it had for the actor. Social scientists are allowed to operate with aggregates or abstract notions as shortcuts, but they must be able to trace them back to the original actions constituting them. This is an explicit call against reification, but in another sense than Alexis Gross talked about, not the reification of the other, but the reification of social entities. Berger and Luckman used it as a pungent argument against structural functionalism, where organizations and whole societies were considered as actors, or they were things that were just emerging. Reifications are, as Berger and Luckman write, quote, taken as a non-human, non-humanizable, inert facticity, end of quote. The postulate of subjective interpretation is a strong argument against sociological reifications in this sense. And I agree with Michael Barber that it's not only a methodological, but ultimately also an ethical postulate. No surprise has Peter Berger called his approach a humanistic sociology. Now, the postulate of adequacy was formulated by Schutz in a rather loose fashion to ensure the consistency between first and second order constructs. Scientific constructs of individual actions must be constructed in a way that they are understood in the world of common sense. Schutz moves on to explicate why and how social scientists construct models of rational action patterns. They will allow for detecting deviations in real life of not so rational or irrational actions, and he illustrates this with an example from economics. As in his book in 1932, where he tried to reconcile the adversary positions of Mises and Weber, he still wants to build a bridge between his approach and his friends from the Mises circle, but also to other sociologists. The methodologist, he writes, is the student of the scientist and not his teacher. Austrian economics has always built models from the subjective perspective of the actor, but not in the refined way as Schutz suggested. Seen this way, Schutz's life world analysis can be seen as describing a huge gap between conventional scientific models and actors' common sense orientation in their everyday life. But why should Schutz undertake this whole effort of phenomenological constitutive analysis only to describe the gap between scientific models and real life? It's much more conclusive to consider his life world analyses as representing or grounding an alternative sociology. The stranger can actually be interpreted as a homunculus model. It's an ideal type with a consciousness, a biographically determined stock of knowledge at hand, and invariant motives dependent on the construction by Schutz. His stranger, however, is not described in the restricted way economic models proceed, but as closely as possible to the real life experience and orientation of a stranger. As a consequence, we should, in my view, interpret the postulate of adequacy in a much more radical way, namely as a requirement to grasp the actual subjective orientation of actors in their everyday life. Now let's go back to the experience of the stranger and move to the fourth point of my presentation, critical issues. Schutz's description of the stranger's experiences remain very formalistic, as we know, with only a few but telling illustrations. For example, that we should read Shakespeare and the Bible in English if we immigrate into an English-speaking country. Much of the social sciences at the time was formal in this way. But nowadays it appears a bit surprising, especially in the context of interpretive qualitative research. So let me move on to some critical aspects. How well did Schutz portray the stranger's experience? The wonderful biography that Michael Barber wrote tells us how much Schutz suffered. Being a Jew in Vienna who was completely assimilated and even fought for Austria in World War I, he remained confronted with a strong and increasing anti-Semitism in Austria. Also in academia, his reference grew. And anti-Semitism finally forced him to leave his home country. He already knew that anti-Semitism was also prevalent in the US. He wrote to his friend Eric Fögelin that they experienced painful weeks, and he was worried about his friends who stayed in Europe Later in life, he once said, there was probably not one day in his life when he was without sorrow. How come that Schutz, who claims to analyze the experience of a stranger, the experience of an immigrant, how come that he leaves away any mention of emotional experiences and the experiences of devaluation, degradation, and humiliation? In spite of the fact that he suffered so much himself, as we know, he received harsh criticisms in this respect from his fellow immigrants at the new school. Both points are intimately connected, but I'm going to treat them separately. First, I consider the absence of evaluative attitudes, not from Schutz, but from the people he talks about. You remember my question at the beginning. When you hear people talking about strangers, how often do they do this in a strict neutral, indifferent way? And how often do you hear evaluative denotations or connotations, either negative or positive ones? Evaluative attitudes towards strangers are pervasive in the whole spectrum between xenophobic and xenophilic. This doesn't concern strangeness versus familiarity, but strangeness in a social relationship, the third type of strangeness in Schutz. It concerns the social acceptance by the group which the stranger wants to belong to. As I already pointed out, Schutz mentioned this, but didn't elaborate it. Schutz has been criticized for eliminating the value relation, which was crucial in Weber's work. The neo-Kantians, such as Heinrich Rickert, but also Weber, considered values as fundamental to culture. For both, empirical reality is culture when we relate to value ideas. Schutz drops this concept, but he incorporates the value relation in his concept of relevance, where it is a little bit hidden. Henri Bergson's concept of attention à la vie, attention to life, and also Husserl made him aware that our relationship to the world, our intentional acts of consciousness, are selective. And Ludwig Mises made him aware that also our pragmatic actions are selective. We always make choices. Most of our relevances are acquired during socialization, and most of them are immanent to our habits. But in contrast to Weber, we don't have to think about value relations. Values are, in a phenomenological sense, given. And the values are not exterior to action, but immanent to action. Of course, we have the ability to reflect on our relevances and change them. Schutz distinguishes between the relevance system of an actor and in his or her everyday life and the relevance system of the social scientist. But for both, values are an integral part of their relevances. Schutz is absolutely aware that our stock of knowledge at hand contains tons of evaluative typifications. And he's aware that we have the ability to produce evaluative connotations anytime when communicating with others. It's a question of our relevance system, which typification we apply to whom, where, and when. This is the reason that Schutz can also provide a formal analysis in his equality paper, but he explicitly talks about in addition, he explicitly talks about degradation and humiliation, as well as about the power of definition. So this is a different stance than in The Stranger. Degradation is an imposed categorization and an imposed relevance system. I agree with Michael Barber that Schutz displays an ethical standpoint in that paper, equality. To treat others with a stereotypical category, to ignore their subjective life worlds, and to humiliate them, as George Yancey has vividly illustrated, is clearly unacceptable to Schutz. His own examples strongly support this point of view. In the same essay, Schutz also speaks of the feeling of degradation or oppression, which brings us to the second critical point, emotions. It's striking that Schutz, in face of all his emotional stress, as someone who fled his country for fear of life, and as a partly discriminated immigrant in New York, does not talk about emotions. In The Stranger, he calls the experience of an immigrant bitter, but the emotional side of the experiences never become an explicit topic. They always pass as side notes. He often says that actors in their everyday lives have their fears and hopes, but this is never further reflected in his formal analysis. This may have different reasons. One may be his personal relationship to emotions. When I met Ilse Schutz in Switzerland in 1984, I asked her if Alfred had ever talked about his feelings, and she confessed nearly never. A second point may be Schutz's adherence to Weber's interpretation that all behavior is derivative from rational behavior. In his methodological papers, Schutz always emphasizes, as Weber, the construction of rational ideal types. Weber distinguishes 4 action types, but considers 3 of them as irrational deviations: value rational, traditional, affective actions, all irrational. Schutz only pointed to these other types in a footnote in his methodological essay of 1953, but never treated them any further. Interestingly, his friend Eric Vögelin writes that Weber's preference for rational action is due to the fact that Weber was ill at ease with sentiments or values. Is the same true for Schutz? Vögelin argued in his own work that the rational sphere is penetrated with feeling and that theoretical objects depend on a pre-theoretical constitution at the level of the sentiments. He criticizes that Schutz neglects the body as condition of life sustenance, the interconnection of animal and higher layers of human experience, and questions about birth, survival, bodily movement, and sexual functions. This is, however, not quite correct. Schutz wrote much about the body until 1936. Then he stopped it. In the Personality manuscript of 1936, he writes, quote, "The somatic basic facts are about my pain, my lust, my heartbeat, my digestion, my sex drive, and the psychological basic facts are about my mood, my experience of landscape, nature, music, my love for you," end of quote. But Schutz considers these emotions as ineffable. That means he's convinced that they are inexpressible and that it's impossible to communicate the intimate contents of these experiences. They are ineffable because they're essentially momentary and not recollectible and of a highly personal nature. A third point for neglecting emotions is the argument that the constitution of meaning is basic. Indeed, one can argue that first you have to constitute a meaningful intentional object or a meaning context before you can either have hopes or fears. Schutz writes that the cogitations in the Cartesian sense, include feelings, volitions, and emotions. This allows him to concentrate on the meaning of the cogitations, as feelings, volitions, emotions are included, but ineffable. Without meaning, there are no feelings, no volitions, and no emotions. Meaning is a centerpiece. Indeed, Schutz came far with this approach, and we still admire him for how far he came. But is he really right that emotions are ineffable, inexpressible, non-recollectable, non-describable? I doubt it. I think this is a blind spot of Schutz. When we turn to literature, we recognize how skillful some writers and poets are in describing emotions very vividly. And when we turn to existentialist philosophers, we find many suggestions how to develop suitable concepts of emotions. Schutz knew this and borrowed some concepts from Heidegger, thrown into the world, and Kierkegaard, the fundamental anxiety. But that's it. Emotions are certainly a very complex matter. I don't think they are ineffable. And I don't think they're non-recollectable. Some are not, but some are. There may be an anthropological component to emotions too. For example, when George Yancey described his horrifying stories, his horrifying experiences about his personal humiliations, he did not talk about his emotions. But all those feelings of consternation and humiliation popped up in myself. The meaning context induced the feelings as a kind of natural reaction. I guess that nobody can sense joy when hearing of such humiliations, and nobody on this earth will sense joy when being humiliated, him or herself, in that way, unless that person is severely pathological. But of course, my feelings may still differ from the feelings of the other, and the sense of understanding may be delusive. In order to approximate our understanding, I think we must go the way which writers, poets, and existentialist philosophers go, namely to try to describe and categorize emotions. Furthermore, we should carefully ponder if the meaning context comes before the sentiments and emotions, or if meaningful objects depend on a pre-theoretical constitution at the level of sentiments, as Eric Fegelin argued. I think that both is true. It may depend on the situation. On the one hand, diatribes, hateful speeches may arouse hatred within the listeners too. On the other hand, traumatized persons may be affected on such deep layers of their personality that anxiety dominates their lives fundamentally, whatever the meaning context is. Yesterday, after an interesting presentation of Jerry Williams on the cultural trauma of indigenous people with their long history of suppression, exclusion, and even extinction, I thought, we can't think about personal trauma without considering emotions. Can we think about cultural trauma without considering emotions? I guess we have to think about that. Now let me sum up and end with a conclusion and an outlook, which is the fifth point of my presentation. First, I started with the observation that the stranger is an ancient and probably universal topos, and that there are more neutral and more evaluative designations. Second, I distinguished three different kinds of strangeness in Schutz. The inaccessibility of the other's experiences is basic to phenomenology since Husserl. The strangeness or familiarity of elements of knowledge is well developed by Schutz. The social acceptance by the foreign group is only mentioned but not developed in the stranger, but taken up in a different and more elaborative form in the equality paper. Third, I inserted a methodological discussion. I pointed to the fact that Schutz always tried to build bridges to the established ways of doing sociology and economics, and that his methodological postulates were, up to their last version, formulated in a conciliatory way. But in fact, I contended he offered an alternative sociology. We can interpret the personal types of the stranger and the homecomer as examples how to implement the postulate of subjective interpretation. Then it's only coherent, however, to interpret the postulate of adequacy much more radically than Schutz's formulation pretend. Social scientific constructions are only adequate if they relate to the constitutive analysis of the structures of the life world. Schutz's whole efforts would not make sense otherwise. Fourth, in face of the humiliation and the feelings of degradation, I asked about the evaluative component in Schutz and his treatment of emotions. Values and value relations are not so obvious in Schutz as they are incorporated in the concept of relevance. Emotions, however, remain the residuum. Schutz considers them as ineffable. Now, how do we proceed from here? Schutz was the uncontested hero phenomenologist in sociology. In the last 2 decades, however, Schutzians have been increasingly challenged by Heidegger's early phenomenology. In the journal Human Studies, we detect more and more articles whose authors speak of phenomenological sociology, but they mean Heidegger and don't even mention Schutz. As Patrick Aspers summarizes, there are 2 approaches to phenomenological sociology today. One is Schutz, who deals with mental states. The other is Heidegger, who deals with practices. And there is a shift from mental practices or from mental states to practices. As we all know, the practice approach is meanwhile widespread and very popular in sociology. There is a real practice turn. Of course, for sociologists who deal with social actions, a practice approach is attractive. But the bothering thing for Schutzians is that exciting new areas of research were opened up by the practice approach and other phenomenologies, as, for example, the realms of affects and emotions and the realms of sensory experiences. These research areas are fascinating and have become very fashionable. But where are the contributions of Schutzians? Sociologists who are interested in the human body in its different aspects don't turn to Schutz, but to Merleau-Ponty or to Hermann Schmitz, a German philosopher who devised the so-called new phenomenology. And people interested in affects and emotions turn to existentialist philosophy and their studies of moods and atmospheres, affective spaces, and sentiments and emotions. Do Schutzians consider these as irrelevant aspects of experiences, or indeed as ineffable? The same happens in regard to sensory experiences. As most other European philosophers, Husserl considered smelling or tasting as inferior animalistic senses, not worth of any philosophical reflection. Husserl, as well as Schutz, considered only superior senses such as seeing or hearing. Meanwhile, representatives of the practice approach investigate not only practices of seeing and hearing, but also practices of tasting and smelling, as well as haptic practices. And by the way, There are also studies on the smelling stranger, an old tapas, but still alive, for example, in Brooklyn, New York. Where are the contributions of us Schutzians on sensory experiences? What Schutz has achieved in his comparatively short lifetime is tremendous. He could not cover everything. But what about us? Do we consider his structures of the life world as the whole spectrum that can be covered? Or do we think this spectrum could be enlarged by additional relevant aspects? Do we tie experiences essentially to knowledge? And that's it? Or do we also consider other dimensions of human experiences? Husserl's phenomenology started with the call back to the things themselves. When I studied ethnomethodology in California, I had the impression that Garfinkel turned to the things themselves. But reading Husserl or Schutz, the things themselves have obviously become very elusive. Most of us who are engaged in phenomenology don't investigate the things themselves. Most of us practice text exegesis, as I did today. We study texts, compare texts, see new connections, new differences and commonalities, and thus produce new insights. This is without doubt interesting and rewarding. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. But can we explore new areas such as affects or sensory experiences if we don't practice concrete phenomenological analysis? If we don't practice phenomenology instead of discussing it? We're obviously struggling with issues we can't solve without doing phenomenological analysis. There is, for example, the issue if the formal structures of the life world are universal or if they are culturally specific. In other words, is there only one life world or are there many life worlds? We can't solve this within a European or Western perspective. I still hope that our esteemed colleagues from Japan, from Taiwan and China, or also from India, from all of these great civilizations of their own, will come up one day with their own life world analysis within their culture. They may reveal that the formal structures of the life world take a different shape within their culture. This would be really enlightening. Until then, we only can work with assumptions. One life world versus many life worlds, Husserl versus Waldenfels. Some of you may remember that I made this appeal to do phenomenological analysis instead of text exegesis already at the first Schutz Circle meeting in New York. And I really thought about presenting today an analysis of my strangest encounter ever. This happened when I visited 2 tribes of Aboriginal people in their homeland in Northern Australia. I really felt as a complete stranger and experienced a significant irreciprocity of perspectives. Later, I analyzed my subjective experience as a stranger in that setting and then compared it with the analysis of Schutz and Schutzians. It was published in German in a book of Jochen Dreher. I considered it, but then I thought, you can't do that in a keynote on Schutz. You have to discuss Schutz. So let me close. I made 3 appeals to Schutzians. First, tackle the area of affects and emotions. Second, tackle the area of sensory experiences beyond seeing and hearing. And third, practice phenomenological analysis of the things themselves. Don't engage only in text exegesis. Maybe this could be topics for future Schutz Circles meetings, or is this too provocative for you? I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you for listening.
very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. Everybody's back. So please use the raised hand. Alexis Gross, just a second. Jerry, you want to get that?
Yeah, I've enabled your microphone, Alexis.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, Thomas. Thank you for your excellent presentation. And I want to ask you something about what you said about feelings. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, I think. I agree with you. In general, there are very few references on feelings in Schutz's work. From the few passages I know, I can say that he understands feelings as ineffable, as you said, and also as essentially actual experiences upon which one cannot reflect. And they seem to be non-intentional and pre-reflective experiences. That's the only few things he says, to my knowledge. But I think there is at least a point of departure for thinking feelings from a Schutzian perspective, which is kind of similar to the perspective of Michel-Henry or maybe Schmitz. I mean, the idea that feelings are non-intentional and pre-reflective. This is maybe a very small idea, but maybe it's a point of departure. What do you think about that?
Can you repeat the last sentence? I'm not sure if I understood the argument correctly.
That
referring to Schmitz.
Yes. I think that in Schutz one can find a very how can I say it? A very short characterization of feelings, which is they are essentially actual experiences upon which one cannot reflect, and they are non-intentional and pre-reflective. And I think this characterization is kind of similar to the one of Schmitz when he describes the feelings, or not feelings, but affectivity as non-voluntary or involuntary experience, which is also pre-reflective and non-intentional, and also in Michel-Henry. So maybe I'm saying that maybe that's kind of a point of departure for thinking feelings from a Schutzian perspective.
Yes, I mean, I did a search on emotions and feelings. There are more instances he talks about feelings than that he uses the word emotion. But there are quite a few such instances. Interestingly, in the structures of the life world, there are only about 4 mentions of feeling or emotion. And I wondered if that was Lachmann, you know, who eliminated that aspect, but also checked the notes for Schutz's notes for where he structured the end product, his 2 volumes of the structures of the life world. And there's only 4 times he talks about it. But he talks many times about it when writing about music, for example. Music is tied to sentiments and to emotions and so. And he talks about the meaning structure of the music and how the meaning structure of the music is necessary to cause the feeling that, for example, you have to repeat the music to reproduce the feeling. But do you think that's correct? I mean, can't you replicate or recollect an emotion? I think I can recollect emotions. For example, falling in love, hearing some wonderful music, it's somehow in myself. I can recollect the feelings. They are not just away. They're not just ineffable. And in other cases, they are. I mean, there are many, especially when Schutz talks about these halos of irrational emotions or irrational values and emotions, halos around the meanings of words and sentences and so on. I think that really goes by very fast. These are actual experiences we can't really capture, and they're not intentional in this sense. But I think there's more about it. Actually, you are the expert on emotions because you're teaching about the topic. And I tried something new. I wanted to go into some new stuff for the keynote. I don't have really a solution, but I think we should really ponder this problem, and also have a more careful look at how Schutz writes about feelings, and relate it maybe also to Eric Voegelin's approach, who says feelings are always there, and the sentiments is always part of a constitution of concepts, for example.
Yes, thank you very much for your answer. I'm not sure if Schutz says that you cannot recollect at all the feeling, but what he says is that you cannot reproduce it exactly as it was in that moment, if I understand it correctly.
Yeah, we would agree on this, wouldn't we? I mean, you never can recollect anything exactly, yes, in Schutz's perspective.
But especially a feeling, especially a feeling is impossible to reproduce. What I'm saying, what my point here is very simple point. I agree with you in what you say in general, but maybe we can try with the very few things he says about feelings to try to maybe going with Schutz beyond Schutz, trying to develop a Schutzian perspective on feelings.
Yeah, I completely.
Yeah.
This is actually what I try to suggest.
Yes. So maybe some of the very few points he makes, that's what my question was about. They are kind of similar with some of the positions of Michel Henry, for example, the idea that feelings have a pre-reflective character first. In this sense, they are essentially actual, because when you reflect on the feeling, that's not the feeling. You're reflecting on the feeling, but the feeling escapes reflection in some sense. I mean, of course, you can reflect on a past feeling, but that's not the feeling itself. So what I mean is that maybe he has some very few ideas that one can take further. That's the only thing. Otherwise, I agree with you.
Maybe I can add something.
Yeah.
You know, when I asked Ilse Schutz about Alfred talking about his emotions, this was the time I was doing a psychotherapeutic training. There was a time when I wanted to become a psychotherapist. And I learned there that many experiences, not only traumatic experiences, but intense experiences you had, which are tied to intense emotions, they're still in your body. They're sedimented in the body. And if you reproduce, for example, the situation, you try to reproduce a situation which you experienced at that time, or a similar kind of experience, the same emotions come up again. You know, you may have problems when you let's say you have to join the army and an officer really degrades you and humiliates you, but you had the same experience already that your own father humiliated you when you were a child. Then you connect the feelings. You remember the feelings you had before, and also you mix them in. So you can, for example, have a reaction which is much more aggressive or much more desperate, which as a contrary, paralyzing, because of that previous experience. And so I think we should really look what are the experiences in other fields. And I think I have learned much about feelings in psychotherapeutic settings, and many feelings are really, many experience of the past tied to feelings are still conserved in your body.
Thanks a lot for your answer, and I also think it's a blind spot in Schutzian scholarship, and we should do more in this matter. So we Schutzians. Thanks.
Right, thank you, Alex.
Thank you. I will cue Michaela. Let's see, here's your microphone.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Michaela.
Hi, Thomas. Thank you very much for your talk. It was really joyful in the sense of emotions and feelings to listen to you. The first thing I would like to say is that yesterday I mentioned that it is the key issue of Benita Luckmann, the question how to feel at home. And now I remember that it is a notion in Schutz's essay on the homecomer. So I would like to reread this essay to see whether he has more explications about feelings in this text. But I have a question too, and I'm not sure whether I got your critique right. In the fourth part of your talk, and you mentioned the rationality and emotions as an integral part of meaning. Do you argue that there is a cognitivist bias in sociology of knowledge, referring to Alfred Schutz, for what we are accused by practice theory? Do we have this cognitivist bias or not? Or do Alfred Schutz has this cognitivist bias?
I do think, yes. I wrote this already in my dissertation, and it has never left me. I see that if you, I have also studied all these things which Schutz has written on the body, and then sentiments and feelings, and I had a short quotation of that. And so his spectrum is, his awareness is really very broad. But I think that if we tie everything to knowledge, and the meaning structures, we lose the connection to the senses, and we lose the connections to the emotions. Schutz was aware of it. I mean, he talked about the feelings when listening to music. Maybe feeling at home is also such an issue. Mm-hmm. He was certainly aware, but he still concentrated on the meaning structure because, as I argued, he said the meaning structures are the basic thing. And the rest is ineffable. And I wonder if it's ineffable, why is it not ineffable to other scientists too?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Michael, would you like to go next?
I don't know whether there are other people who had their hands up before me, I think.
Maybe, why don't we go to you, and then we'll go to Johan, and then Andreas, and then Ken.
Okay. Again, thank you, Thomas. Can you hear me now? Is my voice
yes,
okay?
Yes.
Right.
Okay, thank you for your excellent talk. I was just going to say two things. One, it does strike me that one of the great strengths that Schutz has is that idea of the looking glass, the interconnection of interpretation, subjective, objective meaning, that I think that's why it's so useful in something like race discussions that we saw with George Yancey, for instance. I'm not sure the practice theory gets that, or even Heidegger's notions of intersubjectivity capture some of that. That may be one area where it's quite strong. But I also think, for instance, some of the stuff I've been reading, within 42 minutes of a child's birth, the child is able to look at some adult standing around and mimic the facial expressions of an adult. 42 minutes. And that strikes me, I think your questions here are great. And I think this could get, what you could see in Schutz that gets at that is the notion of typification. That we just immediately pick up bodily, without thinking about it at all, what that adult, and imitate it. And immediately our bodies are sort of geared to each other that way. And this is where I think music, I've been doing some stuff on ritual that gets into questions of smell and music and the bodiliness that's at the root of things. That's why I was mentioning earlier in one of the sessions about how Schutz's idea of the body giving one a whole sense of I can, you know, in my life because I can move. So I think these are really areas that you precisely put your finger on that we need to we can be looking at. And I think there are bridges that can be built between Schutz and say these other, these kind of currents that you're bringing up. Just two comments.
Thank you very much. You know, I'm not very enthusiastic about the practice theory. And I think Schutz has the better approach. But that's one of my points here. You know, I think they have opened up other areas which we have not, and I think we should take these areas as we should tackle these areas too, but from our approach. And I would think we have the better approach. By the way, I didn't know that it's 42 minutes until a baby can
mimic,
imitate mimics. I think this is very difficult to substantiate. I have a colleague and friend who studied somebody in a coma. And they also go like this or this, and they make all kinds of faces. And then it's the problem, how can you interpret it? Is this a smile now, or is this sorrow? Is it an expression of feeling while being in a coma? Or it's very difficult to grasp it if it's really an imitation or not. So I would like to look at that research.
Yeah, the place it is I found it in Sheets Johnstone, you know, Sheets Johnston does some kind of work on this, and she quotes a lot of the literature, and there is a lot of scientific literature, especially on the second person point of view and interactions. The analytic people are doing a lot of work in this area, I think, you know.
Yeah, sure.
The guy that, who's the guy that works on the body, from the phenomenological perspective, I can't remember his name right now, but he quotes this stuff about it. There's a lot of literature was done on that 42 seconds. It's wide, 42 minutes, widespread in a lot of the literature on the body.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I think we should really build the bridges to this. I mean, Merleau-Ponty did this more than Schutz did, you know, to look what the other sciences produced and somehow to take this into account. And I mean, you can't talk about the subjective sense of a baby. I mean, there's no way to communicate in a different form than just by body language.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
We will turn to Johan.
Okay. Hello. Hello, Thomas. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Thomas, thank you very much for your very powerful presentation. And I would like to pick up on Alexis' remarks with relation to emotions and the emotional perspective. And the question would be, you elaborating on the Schutzian essay on the stranger, how would you include the emotional perspective with respect to the experience of the stranger, but also on the one hand, experiencing the stranger by the receiving in-group? How would you actually include the emotional perspective for this experiencing the stranger? That the question actually is, how would you conceptually include the emotional constitution of strangeness?
That's a difficult question. Yeah, it would presuppose that I had already devised something to how to do that. For me, it's a goal right now, and I haven't worked already something out. But I would go in the direction as you suggested, what he did in the equality paper. There he actually tackled the problem of feeling humiliated. But otherwise, you probably have, with a stranger, you would have to do it with an empirical sociology, empirical research. It's difficult to just do it with a constitutive analysis.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sure.
Thank you. Andreas, it's your turn.
Okay. Can you listen? Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you, Thomas, very much for your keynote. I found that very intriguing. And maybe just first a comment. I totally agree with your plea or appeal from the end that I think within the Schutzian paradigm, we should do maybe a bit more than just text exegesis and more work with Schutz's concept, with Schutz's theory on new problems, on new material problems. And that's what I tried, for example, with my presentation on waiting signs. So I think this would maybe also make the Schutzian paradigm a bit more attractive to outsiders if they see that it's not just about rereading and rereading Schutz, which is important for sure, but that we can also do some really material work with Schutz's concept. So I totally agree with that. That's just the first comment. Then I have a second comment to this discussion about emotions and feelings. Is maybe the problem not so much the problem of ineffability, but more the problem of communicability. So if we want to make emotions a topic not of phenomenological introspection, but of social research, actually, then we have the problem of Fremdverstehen, as you said. This is, you also mentioned Weber in this context. So emotions would have been somehow put into language to be able to communicate it to social researchers. And maybe this is another problem or an additional problem, not just the problem of ineffability, if you want to make emotions a topic of social research. So maybe this is another additional problem. And then I have a question, a short one. At the very beginning of his essay on the stranger, Schutz makes few restrictions about the scope of his theory, and you also mentioned them. And the first is that he talks about an adult person, which I think is an obvious restriction. But then he also says the stranger is a person of our time and culture. And I never could really make sense of this. And also your own example, you were talking at the end of your own most impressive experience of strangeness with the Australian Aborigines. If we take Schutz's restriction serious, then this is not a kind of, you would have not have been a stranger in that case in the term Schutz in the understanding Schutz uses the term. So what is your, how do you make, or how do you understand these restrictions by Schutz? Not the first of the adult one, but the culture and time.
Thank you very much. I understand these restrictions as a way to develop a personal type which has a certain consistency. And that's why I interpret the stranger as actually being one of these homunculus construction that Schutz suggested, but usually exemplified with examples from economics. And then the more you restrict it to a personal type, you have then you can keep the motives invariant, because he said my type of stranger, my personal type of stranger is the one who wants to assimilate. He wants to be there and to acquire the same cultural pattern as the others around. This is something he says for his definition. So that's actually his relevant system as a scientist. See, and he says he does this because he would have to enlarge his definition to make it so broad that it's difficult to talk about all these different kinds of strangeness at the same time. That's why I said this in the beginning of my talk. It's important that we also look at other experiences of strangeness. I mentioned to visit as a tourist for other cultures. I mentioned the example to visit an indigenous tribe, and also to look at those immigrants who don't want to assimilate. I mean, that's the big discussion in Europe. And these are other types, other personal types. They have other motives. So either if you go with it, with Schutz, you would have to build another type for the one who doesn't want to assimilate. Like, for example, Michaela Pfadenhauer and Christopher did with these different types of homecomers. You could also talk about different types of stranger. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Ken? Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Andreas. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you too.
We'll go now to Ken.
Can I just intervene?
Oh, yes.
The other question about the ineffability, or it was more a comment, but maybe you would like to comment on that as well.
Yeah, actually, the communicability is a very essential point here. And that's why I suggested we should look around. I mean, our culture, and I think other cultures too, has developed many terms, many designations, many conceptions in a way of emotions. I may come back to that experience in the psychotherapeutic training. It was a Gestalt therapy. So they always operate with feeling. So there's always a question, how do you feel? How do you feel right now? You know, I came as an academic there, and I never felt anything. And I just felt nothing. So in the situation, you know, of being in a group where you learn about psychotherapy, it also consists of doing psychotherapy. And then I realized that others could talk much better about their feelings than I could do. So this is also a question how you grew up. Especially we as males, we usually have not learned how to talk about emotions. And usually women can do this a little better because they are also more focused in relationships. But there is a stock of knowledge within our society which we could tap. And that's why I mentioned writers and poets and others who showed that one can describe feelings quite well, but me as academics, maybe not. So this would also increase, it would acquire to develop our competence, our language competence, you know, to enlarge our language competence, to have the proper typifications to talk about it, to communicate about it.
Yeah. Thank you, thank you.
Ken, now it is your turn.
Hello. Hello. Thank you for the presentation. I was so impressed. And you mentioned in your presentation, you mentioned Garfinkel. Yeah. And in Japanese context, as far as I know, of course, I'm not representative of Japanese context. So as far as I know, but in Japanese context, methodology seems to be very true to the phenomenological slogan, back to the things themselves. So, and they as methodologists are quite aware about that. But at the same time, they rarely mention Schutz recently, and instead they rely on Wittgenstein and Peter Winch. And so I feel we lack the kind of interaction or dialogue between Schutzian and methodologists. And I'm not sure it's true in European context, but I'd like to ask you about the idea about the possible dialogue or possible interaction between Schutzian and methodologists. So yes, this is my question.
Thank you very much for your question. I think you're right. The communication or the interaction between Schutzians and ethnomethodology has died, essentially. We lost George Sathas, and George was the one who would come to every conference to talk about exactly this topic. But within the ethnomethodological scene, there's virtually nobody left who ever talks about Schutz. I think they have not written about Schutz since about the 1990s. And they moved more, as you say, also in the States and I think globally to a Wittgensteinian interpretation that intersubjectivity is always already there. Because they have a methodological problem they don't like to talk about. But the methodological problem is, if they observe an interaction of other people, how can they understand them? How can they find out to what they orient to? This is the leftover of Schutz that you have to find out how, to what people orient, but as an observer and not from the inside. This is a big difference. And of course, if you can't say we have an intersubjective agreement that we can understand what he means, then you can't do ethnomethodology. So you must somehow presuppose that you're part of the game. You know, Garfinkel took actually from Schutz the problem of adequacy and ended up that adequacy is only given if you are part of that group. So if you want to investigate mathematicians, you have to be a mathematician. And in the 80s, he worked with lawyers, mathematicians, and different sorts of people. but they studied the area. They later analyzed it methodologically. How can we, if we don't understand natural sciences, how can we understand what they do in a laboratory? You know, many sociologists entered laboratory of physicists.
Yeah, yes.
I wonder what they ever understood, what happened there. You know, they finally said, well, it's just lifting a glass and putting it there, and this is daily life there, practical actions. But did they understand the real meaning, which was clear for the physicists, but not visible to a sociologist? So I think Wittgenstein is a little trick that you can say, well, we are always we're always in a language game. We share a language game, and that's why we can understand the other, which I doubt.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
I don't hear anybody.
Jerry, oh, I'm sorry about that. Yes.
You have the mic up.
Sorry, I was muted. So I have a question, but I will wait. And if we run out of time, I will just send it to you by email since I have your email address. And we'll go instead to Christopher. And I think, Christopher, you are muted. Yeah, there we go.
Did I raise my hand? I didn't recognize that I raised my hand. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Because of the computer. Actually, I didn't want something to ask, but it was just by occasion that I touched the pad of my laptop. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I will ask a question anyway, because your talk was really, really interesting and inspiring in many ways. For what struck me most maybe was when you mentioned that Schutz had kind of polite way of writing, especially in The Stranger, never attacking other positions. And yes. Because we did this project on Schutz in Vienna and the circles in which he was involved, where we claimed that this is part of the culture of these groups, of these discussion groups, Wissenskultur, we called it cultures of knowledge, and had one of our ideas or hypotheses was that, especially in the Mises circle, also in the Kelsen circle, but more in the Mises circle, it was their way of talking to one another, of dealing with one another, not to criticize the other. The opponent, the intellectual opponent, as they did in the gas class sometimes, but not in the Mises seminar. So they were quite kind of polite. And I asked me whether you would support our idea, because you're quite familiar with this Mises ideas and the Viennese situation. That's my question.
If I support the idea that they didn't...
That this is the origin of Schutz. Habit or attitude towards
the cultural
other positions, not to criticize them, attacking them aggressively, but having this kind of polite way of dealing with the other.
Yes, I think that's certainly true, but you must know it better because you did the research on it, and I only know the academic positions, but not or intellectual positions, but not so much the culture they had in the Mises circle. But it makes sense. I mean, the Mises circle was very exclusive. So once you became a member, you probably behaved in a certain way according to the local culture of that group. But you know, there were also other criteria you could use. For example, Schutz suffered from the fact that the economists of the Mises circle actually did not cite him. They did not quote him, they did not cite him. I mean, Mises had this Human Action book of 1944, and he politely cited Schutz once or twice, but not substantially. And, he just showed I can do completely without Schutz. So it was just also polite to cite him, but he never accepted Schutz's bridge building between Weber. I mean, Mises was so strictly against Weber, Schutz had no chance to say, well, we could reinterpret the ideal type and then the two would fit quite together. So Schutz suffered actually from this, that he was not taken into account from other Mises scholars, like Hayek too. You know, he also had correspondence with Hayek. He also adopted the concept of knowledge dissemination and so on as a concept, which is at the basis of sociology of knowledge too. But Hayek never quoted Schutz. Only Schutz quoted Hayek. And so in that politeness, there may also be these subtle things, these subtle signs, I can do without you, and probably this is already rude enough.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. Good.
Thank you very much. Well, so it turns out we have a couple of minutes. I think then I will ask my question. And again, thank you for a truly wonderful keynote address. And I think there's so many things here that you raised that we could talk about profitably. But again, I want to return to emotions. And I wonder what you think about this proposition, is that the framework, the analytic framework that Schutz provides in making music together, provides perhaps an analytic framework for talking about emotion. He very clearly says that making his argument in making music is to address the non-semantic elements in relationships and how these are communicated. And so it seems to me that it might just be the case that emotion is one of those non-semantic elements of meaning that can be communicated. The other thing, and I'll say too, is that the Bergsonian stamp is clearly on Schutz's making music essay. And yet when you look at Bergson's analysis, you see very clearly that he talks about emotion, but it is not, as far as I know, Bergson's discussions of emotion and tensions of consciousness don't translate into Schutz's writing. I wanted to know, first of all, what you think about using making music as a sort of an analytic framework for talking about emotion, and second, about his obvious neglect of Bergson's treatment of emotion.
Thank you very much. I actually had the same thought. I saw that in this making music together, also a little with Mozart and the philosophers, he really talked about those issues. And I sometimes think that in the structures of the life world, there are many interesting aspects of Schutz which are not taken up in the structures, you know, and that's why I also would turn to that music. And I don't have it so present that I could give you an answer and a substantial answer now, but I think there is a cue. There's really a key how we could tackle it a little bit further. Because it's on another level. It's music is a different world than language, for example. It's a different kind of communication. And it has to do with, I think he says there that music is always tied to sentiments. I mean, that's the message of music, sentiments and emotions and so. And he also says that in the opera, you have both. You have the drama of words and the drama of the music. So it's Schutz considers it as the highest form of the art, the opera, because you have both together. But I don't know more about it. But I think that's also the way I would go next.
Yeah, interesting. And I think there's one particular tool in the essay that could have, for example, we talked earlier about the possible ineffability of emotions, and Schutz suggests that music right? When we listen to music, it is constituted in consciousness in a polythetic way, step-by-step way. But in recollection, we can only recollect it in a monothetic way. And so it seems to me that we can do the same thing with emotions. We experience them polythetically, step by step, in an unfolding way. And yet I can certainly recall states in which I was angry or happy or in love, right? And so I can experience them monothetically. So I think that essay maybe has some tools, but I really appreciate your encouragement to us to consider emotion. One other comment I wanted to make in regard to your call for us to go beyond exegesis of texts, because I heard in my head as you were saying that Lester Embre's common encouragement to us to actually do phenomenology, to move beyond the exegesis of texts. And so I heard Lester Embre in your call to us. Well, thank you again for your talk.
Thank you too, Jerry. Actually, I wanted to include Lester because he passed away, so I thought I want to include Lester in my talk too. And interestingly, I mean, he studied with Dorian Cairns, and Cairns supplemented or complemented Husserl with beliefs and values and these other aspects, which he calls it positings. You know, it's not only the experiences, expectings, recollectings, and perceivings, but it's also believings, valuings, and willings as a positing. And he had that from Dorian Cairns. And so I actually wanted to include it, but my keynote was too long anyway, so I just cut it out.
Great. Thank you very much for your response.
Okay, let's all give Thomas another round of applause. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Thomas.
Thank you for the discussion.
Okay, and so we'll end this day of the meeting. Tomorrow morning, we have the business meeting. So if many people want to join as possible, that would be great. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.